Now that's a lot of damage!
Charge arrow.
The mother soul was.
All right. Good evening, Exiles, and welcome to my updated guide for my Ball Lightning Arrow Ranger build. It's been a bit over 2 weeks since I made my last update on this guide, having just reached the true endgame of pushing for Pinnacle encounters when that video was originally recorded. But since then, I've managed to take the build quite a bit further, taking down every major T4 boss in the game in less than 30 seconds apiece, as well as optimizing the build for T18 breach mapping, all on an affordable price tag. To do this, I've been making tons of optimizations to this build across just about every aspect. So today, we're going to be going over all of the skill gems and supports yet again, but while focusing on what's been changed about them, talking about the passive tree as well as what's changed there, optimal rotations, and how to play this build to its fullest potential, going over all the gear used in the build, and then finally finishing up by answering all of your frequently asked questions that I've been getting since the last guide. Keep in mind, however, that all of this is still going to be covered in great detail for those who haven't seen the previous guide. So even if you've never seen my build before, you should be able to keep up just fine. This is, of course, also a lot of information to cover, so as usual, there will be chapters in the description for your viewing convenience. With that all being said, though, let's start off with the skills. Lightning Arrow is still core to the build, as you'd expect, still being utilized to quickly combo with our other core skill, Lightning Rod, to detonate the rods under large packs of enemies, or otherwise used on its own to take out weaker packs of mobs. Although it has, notably as the build scaled up, fallen completely out of use when it comes to bossing encounters, which we'll be discussing in greater detail later on. For the supports, we are still, however, using Martial Tempo, Lightning Infusion, Primal Armament, and Rising Tempest, as this maximizes the skill's DPS, so nothing has changed there. For a sixth link, we are now using Fork, which, well, forks our projectiles, drastically improving the overall area of effect it has. Lightning Rod is no longer just our main combo, but our main source of damage for bosses wholesale. Each rod fired into the ground is chained to up to 16 times at my current level, dealing their initial damage once again in what ends up being a large explosive radius. For support gems, it stayed the same. Scattershot for more rods deployed per cast, which leads to multiplicatively more DPS. Normally, a skill gaining additional projectiles would not be able to impact the same target with those projectiles. But once the rod is in the ground, reactivations of those rods are counted as individual attacks and can therefore all hit the same target, dramatically improving the skill's DPS despite the loss of attack speed and per rod damage. Magnified effect for increased area of effect, greatly improving your surface area and clear speed capability, as well as conduction, which is extremely important, as the 100% multiplicative increase to shock chance is going to be activating cast on shock consistently due to each of the 20 individual rods having a chance to shock. Lastly, Heft is our sixth link, which is a very large increase in damage. When fighting Pinnacle Bosses, however, I want to mention that area of effect really doesn't do us any good, as the rods simply fall more spread out in addition to carrying an increased area of effect. So, the overlap in rods is more or less the same no matter what, as long as you're properly centering the rod's cast on the boss. For this reason, during Pinnacle Bosses, I like to swap out Magnified Effect for our Elemental Armament on Lightning Arrow, as we won't actually be using any Lightning Arrow casts during the boss anyway, for 25% more damage. This is thankfully the only gem swap I'll advise for Pinnacles, but it is a significant one if you need the extra damage. All right, on to our first spirit gem, which is going to be, of course, Cast on Shock, a meta gem that builds up charge from the enemies we manage to shock, and upon reaching maximum energy, deploys the skills socketed within. In this case, we're using Ball Lightning, which fires balls of lightning. Go figure. The balls can and do activate our lightning rods, so by spamming lightning rods on bosses, we get a chain of events started where an infinite number of balls of lightning fly from our character towards the rods, which fire off the rods, causing more shocks, which in turn, of course, causes more balls of lightning. This is the key reason we've taken conduction on Lightning Rod, as we need as many of those rods to be proccing shocks as possible to get a near constant beam like fire rate going on our balls of lightning, scaling our rare and bossing DPS to absurd levels. To achieve this, the supports for this combo have stayed the same from the previous guide. Energy retention and impetus for better energy generation, as well as deceleration to slow the balls down, causing them to stay within the radius of our lightning rods for longer, causing more activations per cast. And in the sixth slot, we're using inspiration. And if you don't have a sixth link, you'll want to be socketing inspiration over energy retention if you have more than a couple extra projectile levels in your gear. Reason for this is, unfortunately, Ball Lightning is scaling up with those extra projectile levels, increasing the mana cost dramatically, even though we benefit very little in DPS from it doing so. As far as skill rank, you want to leave both Cast on Shock and Ball Lightning at only level 11, which has an intelligence requirement of 95. You can technically take Cast on Shock higher, but in my experience, you'll already be firing more Ball Lightning casts than you can even utilize, so increasing the energy generation with more skill levels is not likely to be beneficial, but likely actually detrimental instead. So leave it at level 11 only. For our next spirit gem, we're still using Herald of Thunder, which is a massive improvement to our mapping and clear speed capability. Every time an enemy dies while shocked, which is basically always with this build, you're getting additional lightning bolts added to all further attacks, especially when you've maxed the quality of the skill and managed to get it up to level 21, where it becomes able to deploy up to 6 lightning bolts potentially between each kill. So in practice, this causes a proliferation of bolts of lightning to rain down on our enemies every time we fire off a lightning arrow into the crowd, as Herald procs kill and shock enemies, causing you to generate more Herald procs, which continually strike every enemy in the pack, leaving none left alive. And hilariously, because each of our lightning rods, once they are deployed, are individual attacks, when chained to, this means each enemy being struck by a deployed lightning rod during map clearing can then be subjected to up to 6 strikes from this aura on a per kill basis for some really crazy extra damage on rares. For the support gems, we're still going to be going with Innervate, as it's a practically always on 35% damage buff during mapping. Long shot, as most strikes are occurring further away from our character, this ends up being most of the time at least 20 to 25% more damage on our Herald. Lightning Mastery, which is required to reach the breakpoint of level 21, granting us that 6th potential bolt. And finally, Coursing Current, which is part of how we are going to be proliferating Herald of Thunder across massive packs of enemies without utilizing Herald of Ice to chain off of each other. Coursing Current has a chance to shock other nearby enemies every time Herald of Thunder causes a shock, which in turn causes more lightning bolts as it cascades through the groups of enemies following a lightning arrow, clearing entire screens of enemies with the click of a button, no other heralds necessary. And as an added optional 6th link, you can add in Execution to increase the consistency of the Herald confirming kills for you. For our final spirit gem, we're using Wind Dancer for a huge chunk of multiplicative evasion. In the previous version of our build, it wasn't required to have enough spirit to activate this gem full time. However, in this iteration, we are 100% going to be attempting to achieve enough evasion to make the Acrobatics passive worthwhile, which is going to strip away 70% of our total evasion in exchange for being able to dodge every type of hit in the game that isn't just a damage over time effect. For supports, we are running Wind Wave, which will deploy a knockback effect should we ever become stunned that works independently from Wind Dancer's own knockback effect, triggered when we lose our stacks upon being attacked in melee for some extra safety. Blind, which will blind any melee attacker should they pop our Wind Dancer, and the next two are going to be dependent on if you have the extra spirit for them or not. Neither are necessary, but they are both nice, bringing our total spirit requirement to 120 without these and 145 with them. The first is Cannibalism, which restores 4% of our maximum life on kill. During large breaches, this basically makes you invincible as long as you keep shooting. Don't get CC'd, and don't get killed in just one hit. And Clarity for some additional mana regeneration, as you can never really truly have enough of it. Although, if you need to cut one of these, you should definitely be cutting out Clarity first. Next is Orb of Storms, which is capable of proccing our lightning rods for even more bossing DPS, while also functioning as a form of deployable area denial that can be used to keep us safe whenever we're fighting in enclosed spaces. For example, during a ritual or during a simulacrum. As most anything walking into an Orb of Storms covered in lightning rods is basically assured to die near instantly. The first four supports have remained the same. Chain, allowing the orb to proc more activations of our lightning rods, persistence to keep the orb in play for longer periods of time, so we have to recast less often during boss encounters, and unleash plus overabundance, which together causes our orb to be deployed twice in a single cast. And although this reduces the damage the orb themselves do, this doesn't matter at all as we're just using it to proc lightning rods. For the sixth link, we have something new, and that's going to be Font of Rage. Rage acts as a multiplicative increase to our attack damage, so basically all of our damage, stacking up to 30%. We're going to be spending just about every possible moment of our boss fights right next to this thing. So Font of Rage ends up being anywhere between an average of 10% to 30% total DPS increase in those situations, which is pretty massive for the Pinnacle encounters. You will absolutely want to 6-link this skill if you plan to do a lot of Pinnacle boss farming, as it carries a lot of value there. But otherwise, you won't be getting much of any benefit from it. For the skill rank, leave this at 11 unless you manage to reach 150 intelligence consistently. If you're sure you'll never fall below 150 intelligence again, you can bring this up to level 15, which is a breakpoint that causes it to deploy more chains and at a faster rate. Voltaic Mark is still a huge boost to both bossing damage and mid-game clear speed, so it stayed much the same, and by that I mean you can leave it completely empty. You can throw mobility in, I guess, but here's hoping we get some mark supporting gems later down the line, as there isn't much in any way of good options here unless you're going to use this for mapping. Use this on bosses or any rares you might be having trouble with in the mid game to boost your shock chance by a multiplicative 50% and increase your shock magnitude in boss fights for a higher multiplicative overall damage increase due to shock. Barrage is a completely new skill to the build, replacing Magnetic Salvo past the mid game, which falls off pretty hard in usefulness. Barrage causes your next bow skill to fire 3 times in rapid succession at a small damage penalty. And by small, I mean 1% less damage when it's at max quality. This is part of our main boss opener, I'll be covering in detail later. But basically, what it comes down to is Barrage has roughly the same cast time as it takes to fire a lightning rod. So by activating Barrage, you gain an extra lightning rod worth of DPS each time in exchange for an extra button press. It can also be useful during mapping. You activate it directly before encountering rares or strong monsters, and you'll be casting 3 nearly instant lightning rod deployments to their position as soon as you get onto their screen. And as those lightning rods fall one after another, they'll all trigger each other for a very large burst of near instant damage. For support gems, we'll be using Arcane Tempo to lower the cast time to make it more in line with about the same pace you could cast a Lightning Rod. Premediation, which will actually multiplicatively increase the initial strike of the rod's deployment by Barrage by 14% in total instead of being reduced by 1%. Ingenuity to reduce the cooldown of the skill for better uptime, and finally, Murderous Intent, which grants any skill deployed by Barrage Culling Strike, allowing Barrage to also act as a boss finisher, culling their last remaining 5% HP, while adding to the likelihood firing Barrage at a rare enemy causes them to instantly be dismissed from this plane of existence. The last skill is purely for bossing at this point, but has remained exactly the same. That's going to be Electrocuting Arrow. Pretty straightforward. Using Electrocuting Arrow on an enemy causes you to do a clunky flipping animation over the target, which, once embedded in the target, causes all incoming lightning damage to build up towards an electrocution proc. Electrocution being a 5-second stun that will even work on Pinnacle bosses, just like a freeze. Basically, if a fight is going to go on for more than a couple seconds, such as Pinnacle encounters, we want to add this into our opening rotation so we can lock down the boss for some perfect, uninterrupted uptime. And thanks to some new tech we'll be discussing in the passive tree portion of the guide, this becomes extremely quick to activate and very reliable. The only support that really matters here is Unbreakable, as it's very awkward to have this skill cancelled mid-animation, although if you don't have enough strength to use this, it's the first one I'd drop from the build. Neural Overload, which will activate the electrocution a bit early if you fire the skill again at the boss after it reaches 80%, and Electrocute, so the initial hit also contributes towards the electrocution buildup on the target. For a 6-link priority, I recommend Lightning Arrow first to boost your clear speed, followed by Herald of Thunder for the same reason. Afterwards, Cast on Shock, then Lightning Rod, and finally, Orb of Storms last. None of these 6 links are what I would call necessary, but they are optimal, so I'm including them in the guide. That's it for the skills. So, moving on to the passive tree, where quite a bit has changed, we're going to be incorporating a weapon swap so that we have a mapping setup on our first weapon set and a pinnacle bossing setup on our second weapon set, giving us the best of both worlds. This ends up being not at all difficult to utilize either. Basically, if you're at a pinnacle boss, you'll be swapping sets and then simply moving your bow and quiver to your second set with you. This allows us to shift up to 24 points in our tree to better accommodate endgame mapping and endgame bossing as individual activities. As far as our Ascendancy is concerned, I've tested alternatives since the last video, but going for Gathering Winds and Wind Ward, granting us the Ramping Tailwind buff for 30% skill speed, 10% movement speed, 150% increased evasion, and 30% damage resistance is simply the best option. Alongside Point Blank for 20% multiplicative damage on all lightning rods, as well as anything we fire personally at close range, with an extra projectile added from endless munitions to all our attacks, including ball lightning. No matter how I look at it, these are going to be the best options for our Ascendancy, and it's just not close. So as you can see, we've kept everything more or less the same until we come to the section with Spreading Shocks and Thunderstruck. We've removed Thunderstruck entirely due to us not needing electrocution outside of Pinnacle bosses, while the path leading to Spreading Shocks has become part of Weapon Set 1, from now on referenced as our mapping setup. This is because we don't need this notable during Pinnacle fights, but the way this interacts with crowds of enemies in Herald of Thunder, further greatly improving our ability to cascade and proliferate bolts of lightning across screen loads of enemies, so it is absolutely worth spending the points here to pick it up. I've tried several setups where I've dropped this, and I always ended up coming back to it. We've also removed the line leading up to Catapult entirely, which was a big chunk of area of effect. This is because we've actually also changed the pathing leading to Flash Storm and dropped Emboldened Avatar as well as Force of Nature due to us still hitting 75% total penetration without it. which just so happens to be how much resistance the Pinnacle bosses have. We then take Lightning Rod, which makes all our non critical lightning hits lucky. We're working with very low crit rate, and as lightning damage has the highest damage variance in the game, this averages out to typically a 20 to 30% increase in overall damage for us, making it the most desirable notable on the entire passive tree. This is also made even more powerful by the fact we use Heft on our lightning rods, which is a further increase to only maximum damage, further increasing that variance. We take the nearby jewel socket, then on our mapping weapon set, we're also taking Authority as well as the neighboring attack area nodes. This is an overall damage loss compared to doing Catapult, but grants a 21% increase to our area of effect, with Lightning Rod and Herald of Thunder most notably. So if you can sacrifice a bit of damage to get these, do so. And if you can't, you should instead do the Catapult line until you can. We have dropped freedom of movement and streamlined the pathing to catalysis, as well as the jewel socket, which costs us a small amount of evasion. Now that we're doing endgame breaches with this build, we also want acrobatics. I talked at length about why acrobatics was a bad idea in my last video, and everything I said remains true. That is until you reach the sweet spot, as I refer to it. If you can take acrobatics and still stay at 70% or higher evasion without your tailwind stacks, then you should be using acrobatics, as it's going to feel like an overall net positive. But if you try to run acrobatics with lower evasion, you're going to get torn to pieces. I've also dropped Unbound Forces as well as the nearby Elemental node, but kept Storm Surge as it's necessary for getting us up to 75% penetration. I've removed Harmonic Generator and General Electric, as Magnitude does have some diminishing return to it, just like damage increases do. And in my experimentation, I was still generally getting more damage from raw damage improvements than Shock Magnitude, as we're not a Stormweaver. Instead, we've redistributed the points and taken Kite Runner for more projectile speed, which becomes damage thanks to Feathered Fletching, some projectile damage, and a nice 3% movement speed buff. Lastly, for weapon set 2, our Pinnacle Bossing setup, we're investing into Magnitude as we've exhausted all the most desirable raw damage increases in the area, and as this set is for bossing, we know we're getting maximum value from Magnitude. So we take Frazzled for 75% more magnitude between the notable and the nodes leading to it, as well as some mana regeneration, which is a factor we are constantly trying to stay ahead of the need for. We're also taking Electrocution, which causes electrocuted enemies to take 20% increased damage, and Electrotherapy for 5% increased skill speed. The paths to both these notables increase our electrocution buildup by 95% in total. This basically makes it so our electrocution buildup is going to take hold and stun lock the boss before they even get to fire their second ability during pinnacle fights, while also increasing the damage we deal to them in this state. With our final 3 points for the bossing setup, we'll slot in Harness the Elements, and the last 2 for our mapping setup, I like to settle them into 4% additional movement speed at the start of our tree. This settles every point with both setups up to level 95, giving us some great crowd control capability and maximized DPS against pinnacle bosses, as well as large area of effect, screen tearing, PC bricking power when it comes to late game mapping at the flip of a switch. Now, if you can't be bothered swapping for pinnacles or you're just not at them yet, of course, use the mapping setup. And although the pinnacle boss setup is obviously more optimal for its task, I have used the mapping setup to kill them all as well. So it's really just some extra optimization at the end of the day, and only likely necessary if you're working on a budget version of the gear set. If you'd like to see more in-depth reasoning behind the rest of the passive tree, I went over all of it start to finish in the last build guide, so feel free to check that out if you haven't already. It's of course time-stamped, so you can check it out real quick and come right back. It's also worth mentioning I do stream 3 times a week, and I am reachable through my community Discord in the pinned comment below. So if anyone has any questions or concerns with the build, I will be more than happy to answer them there. We're now going to be talking about how to maximize the usage of the skills in this build. Keep in mind there will be some variance with how you'll have to approach various combat situations based on how strong your gear is, but I'll do my best to cover the widest range of scenarios that I can. When combating white and magic monster swarms at the highest end, a single lightning arrow will proliferate a storm of herald procs through entire chunks of the screen, destroying them instantly. But a more flexible rotation is to drop lightning rod followed by 2 arrows repeating infinitely. By tapping your skills and rotating between them, you prevent the vast majority of the slowdown effect normally applied to your character when holding down attacks. So, this rotation not only helps to optimize your damage against the vast majority of enemies, but optimizes your movement as well. If you're struggling to bring down magic packs due to being on the lower end of the gear pool, incorporate Voltaic Mark into your map clearing for an additional burst of damage. If you're playing this build throughout campaign, you'll probably be doing this pretty often. I know I was. When finding yourself in combat in a confined space, make sure to be utilizing your Orb of Storms to set up an area of denial with your lightning rods. During events like rituals, simulacrums, and the beginning of breaches where things can be a bit claustrophobic, throwing down this combo will keep you relatively safe by spawn killing any would be threat within its radius before it can get to you. On top of that, during breaches, this combo can wall off an incoming portion of the breach while you move away to engage another side, giving you a brief period where you are confirming kills in 2 places at once, improving your breach efficiency by quite a bit when doing so. When combating rare monsters at the high end, a single lightning rod and a lightning arrow should get the job done, or at least close enough that the preceding ball lightning procs will finish it off. If this is not the case for you, instead cast Voltaic Mark, followed by 1 to 3 casts of lightning rods into lightning arrows. If this still isn't enough, incorporate Orb of Storms as well, as this should take them down even at the lowest of gear ranges consistently. For the bossing rotation, we start with a pretty universal opener as every Pinnacle boss currently begins with a long winded startup to the encounter, allowing us to get our full setup in. You're first going to be stacking up Rage with your Orb of Storms, then proceed into the boss arena. Keep Orb of Storms up at all times throughout the encounter, and proceed to lay out 20 lightning rods beneath the boss, likely taking 4 casts of the skill if you're firing 5 arrows apiece. Right before the boss begins combat, activate Barrage. As soon as the boss becomes active, mark it with Voltaic Mark, then launch your tripled lightning rod utilizing your barrage buff, and proceed to activate Electrocuting Arrow. From this position, things get simple. Maintain Orb of Storms on the boss, as I said. Maintain Voltaic Mark. Try to stay about 3 meters from the boss and near the Orb of Storms to maximize DPS, and just proceed to blast lightning rods until the boss goes down while keeping Barrage on cooldown for the extra DPS. For the most part, acrobatics and evasion is going to keep you safe from harm, but you should still make sure to get out of the way of anything that could potentially one-shot you just to be safe. By utilizing this rotation, I've managed to delete Zesht, King of the Mist, Arbiter, and Zarok while carrying 2 other players within just 30 seconds each or less. Now, I know what some of you must be thinking. To accomplish all of that, this guy's build has to be worth hundreds of divine orbs or even mirrors. But that's just not the case, and I'll show you as much in the gearing section now that this build is still, although more expensive than my previous entry-level endgame setup, very obtainable. We're going to begin by, of course, talking about the bow, where things can potentially get the most expensive. But I can happily say that that's not quite the case. Well, at least not yet. We'll see what happens after I post this guide. The most important factor with your bow is the total DPS of the weapon. It does not much matter if it's physical or elemental as long as that element is lightning. And that's going to be one of the advantages of this build, seeing as cold has become a bit more popular despite them being very comparable in strength. When it comes to the base, you of course want an expert dual string bow. The best in slot prefixes would then be percent physical damage, flat physical damage, and lightning damage. For the suffixes, we're looking for bow attacks fire 2 additional arrows, attack speed, and dexterity. Now, you're probably thinking, why not projectile skill levels instead of dexterity? And the answer to that is it's terrifying to add another 5 skill levels into what's currently going on with this build as I have it right now. Once your ball lightning begins to outpace your ability to generate mana, you lose all of your DPS. So, 5 more skill levels doubling its mana cost could definitely be the tipping point, and the cost of finding out or not would be several mirrors worth of currency to craft, as it's unlikely anyone will ever craft a bow tailor made to my build for you to mirror service off of. So, although it could be the very best bow in existence for this build if you could work around the mana issues, I cannot, in good conscience, tell anyone it's a good idea to pursue that, knowing how much it could cost them. And even still, the bow I've described is probably a mirror, anyways. Don't worry, I know that's absurd. Remember, this is just the best in slot item, the ideal we can strive to achieve, and maybe only Belton will. Next up is my bow. We'll call this the middle ground as far as budget is concerned. I purchased this for 7 divine orbs, which is not cheap, but the bow in the previous video was bought for 1 and ended up selling for only 15x only by the time I was done with it. This bow does just over 400 DPS and has a bit of critical damage and dexterity, but no extra projectiles, as that would be absurdly expensive and I'm no Wolf of Val Street. 7 divs is pretty achievable with a character established in the endgame economy. But as a budget option, you want to shoot for 350 or more total DPS, all of which either physical or physical enlightening. And any positive suffix you can get your hands on, which shouldn't cost you more than a divine orb at the time of recording. For context, this budget bow is better than what I used every moment of my endgame experience up until I started playing with the idea of defeating T4 Pinnacle encounters, where I finally did upgrade to this one. All right, that was pretty long winded for just the first item, but now that we've set the stage and expectations for what's going on here, we'll be going a bit faster. Your quiver is the second most important item when it comes to your DPS, so you'll want a good one. The best in slot mirror quiver for us is flat physical damage, flat lightning damage, and increased damage to bow skills in the prefix slots. And in the suffix slots, +2 to level of all projectile skills, plus dexterity, and plus attack speed, all on a primed quiver base. My current quiver, which, if it were on a primed quiver base, would likely cost 15 divines, instead cost me only 3 due to being a visceral quiver. Now, we don't particularly care about critical hit chance for attacks as a base, but damage is damage at the end of the day. And as you can see, I have the best in slot stats, but only 1 tier 9 flat damage roll, a dead suffix in the form of life gained on kill, and a low tier dexterity roll. So this could be quite a lot better, but upgrading beyond this would cost me 10 or more divines that I just don't have, so this is what I used. As a budget option, be willing to pick up and utilize any quiver with physical and lightning flat damage with a sum of 40 or more with +2 to projectile skill levels. Anything beyond that is going to be icing in comparison. This budget quiver won't cost you more than 5 exalted orbs. The best in slot amulet would be 45 spirit, as it's what's required to run Wind Dancer plus clarity and cannibalism, maximum life, and percent evasion for prefixes. For suffixes, we want +2 projectile skills, dexterity, and intelligence, all on an Azure amulet for the extra mana regeneration. This amulet is basically a unicorn. To my knowledge, one has never been crafted or posted yet, but if it ever is, it'll surely cost hundreds of divines. The Anointment for Wildstorm, which grants 15% more maximum lightning damage, our best in slot, would also cost a further 7 divines. My current amulet is pretty close to that, although only the life roll is T9, and I'm missing intelligence. This amulet cost me 2 divine orbs, however, it was about as close as I felt I was going to get to the unicorn amulet in this lifetime, so I have splurged on the Wildstorm anointment, costing me an extra 7, bringing the total cost of my amulet to 9 divs. For a budget amulet, though, we need at least 30 spirit, although 45 would be ideal, as I said, maximum life, and +2 to projectile skills. Anything beyond that is purely icing, which will run you 1 divine orb as long as you're not picky on the base, which you shouldn't be because it matters very little when it comes to our amulet. For the anointment, the budget options are High Alert, which costs 3 exalts at most, granting 50% increased evasion when on full life. The more mid tier option is to instead go with Essence of the Storm, which grants you 5% of your total damage as additional lightning damage, as well as 30% shock chance, costing only 37 exalted orbs to anoint instead, which is going to be my personal recommendation, bringing the budget amulet up to a total cost of 1 divine and 37 exalts. All right, now that it's down to our armor and the uniques, it's important to stress that you must cap your elemental resistances utilizing only your helmet, body armor, belt, and boots, as your ring slots are going to be occupied with Thief's Torment, which cannot be used alongside any other rings. This fixes our mana issues relatively permanently as long as you don't go overboard on skill levels, as I said. This is universal, no matter your budget, and mandatory for taking on pinnacle boss fights comfortably, as you'll otherwise be too lacking on mana to perform. Luckily, you can get these for between 1 to 3 divines. Mine being 3, as I saw it had a corruption that didn't brick the item. But poorly rolled ones will be going as low as 1 div, and the standard for well rolled, uncorrupted rings is 2 divines. Picking this ring up as soon as you can is going to do wonders for the build as long as it doesn't throw your resistances into the trash for doing so. Next, we're moving on to the gloves. The best in slot and my current gloves are actually one and the same this time, that being the Hands of Wisdom and Action. This build needs to stack a decent amount of intelligence anyway, so getting extra lightning damage for your trouble is only natural, and the dexterity scaling is a big boost to our DPS in its own right. While these gloves do carry a lot of DPS for us, they come with no resistances at all, no maximum life, and not really any evasion to speak of. So the rest of your gear really has to pick up the slack to accommodate for these should you choose to run them. As a budget option until then, you'll be looking for any dexterity based glove with flat lightning damage, flat physical damage, and maximum life as the prefixes, with as much resistance as possible loaded into the suffixes, whether that be fire, lightning, cold, or chaos. Dexterity can also be substituted in as a suffix if you need more stats to meet requirements for the build to function. Gloves that fit these parameters will cost anywhere between 50 exalted orbs to a divine orb. The perfect best in slot helmet utilizes a hunter hood base and would include tier 8 rolls for both evasion rating and percent increased evasion in the prefixes, as well as tier 10 maximum life, granting the user more than 900 evasion and 150 maximum life after quality. The best in slot suffixes being whatever elemental resistances you needed to reach caps, whether that be fire, lightning, cold, or even chaos. Chaos would obviously be more expensive, but does not even currently exist for trade at the moment. And for the rune socketing, all elemental resistance or chaos resistance would be optimal depending on your needs. A helmet like this would run you upwards of 20 divine orbs. My current helmet, though, is actually extremely close to the best in slot, although it has no straight up percent increased evasion roll. It instead has a tier 5 maximum life and percent increased evasion hybrid roll, which is something you should be willing to utilize as an option at the expense of the top end evasion you get more maximum life. Something I'd argue we can sometimes need even more than more evasion. a tier 10 maximum life roll, and tier 8 flat evasion roll, all together getting my helmet up to 821 evasion after being socketed, which honestly, I kind of wish I'd have done chaos resistance instead, but it is what it is. If I had done that, it'd be at 720 or so evasion, 204 maximum life from the prefixes, with triple resistances in the suffix modifiers. This is pretty close to perfect and ended up costing me actually only 5 divine orbs, but I feel they probably underpriced this piece. Now, as a budget option, be open to using a felt cap, hunter hood, or swathed cap as a base. Shoot for 500 or more evasion without the rune socketed, and 119 or more maximum life, as well as 3 resistances with a total sum of 90% or more. Then, socket either all elemental resistance or chaos resistance, depending on if you still need more elemental resistance or not. The total cost for a budget helmet like this is going to only be between 20 exalts and 1 divine. Body armor. The best in slot base is going to utilize an expert studded vest. Tier 11 flat evasion, tier 8% increased evasion, and a tier 13 max life roll, granting between 200 and 214 maximum life for the prefixes. For the suffixes, triple of any resistance, tier 8 or tier 6 chaos resistance is likely preferred, but no one would be upset about a tier 8 dexterity roll here either. In total, with 2 socketed iron runes, this chest piece grants in excess of 2100 evasion, which will then be doubled thanks to our bestial skin notable. This perfect body armor currently costs 350 divine orbs, and as far as I can tell, there is only one in existence at the moment. Now, my current body armor is an expert studded vest with 1940 evasion total, 176 maximum life, and 2 tier 7 elemental resistances with a throwaway line of stun threshold. This armor cost me 8 divine orbs, making it my second most expensive piece besides that amulet anointment. For a budget option, an expert studded vest capping out at around 1500 or more evasion with 140 or more maximum life and 2 resistant suffixes won't even actually run you 1 divine orb. But if you're willing to step it up to around 1800 evasion, it's going to be closer to 3 to 5 divine orbs, depending on how much you're willing to invest. And because of how powerful our chest piece is for determining total evasion, it'll be in your best interest to upgrade this off the budget tier later on, as it's going to be very difficult to reach our 70% acrobatics evasion, no tailwind sweet spot without a good chest piece. The best in slot belt for this build uses a utility belt base, although there is an argument for using a strong rolled ingenuity to double our Thief's Torment, allowing us to potentially utilize those forbidden higher skill levels we talked about. This is unexplored territory, though, as I've never tested how this would work out, as the belt's pretty expensive. Instead, the safer best in slot approach is to simply use a standard utility belt for 20% instant flask recovery with 150 or more maximum life, 165 or more maximum mana, increased flask mana or life recovery rate plus 35% for the prefixes, and then triple T8 elemental resistances or a tier 6 chaos resistance mixed in. A belt like this would cost 25 or more divine orbs. My current belt has 153 maximum life, 94 mana, some strength, which helps with support gem requirements, and 2 elemental resistance rolls. Maximum mana really doesn't come into play often with this build after getting Thief's Torment, and although I'm not chaos resistance capped, taking this belt any further would be too costly for me to want to bother, so I've stuck with it. This belt cost me just 1 divine orb. For a budget option, look for a utility belt with 120 or more maximum life and a sum of 75 or more resistances in the suffix slots. This budget option won't cost you more than 20 exalted orbs. And finally, the boots. Best in slot boots will utilize the Expert Lizard Scale boots or Expert Steel Toe boots base with 120 or more maximum life, 92% or more percent increased evasion, and 35% movement speed in the prefixes, with a set of, you guessed it, triple elemental resistances in the suffixes, or with chaos resistance mixed in depending on the user's needs. Boots of this caliber are currently running for 45 or more divine orbs. For my boots, I have the 35% movement speed and 136 maximum life, but not the evasion, as well as only double resistance with a throwaway stun threshold line. This is probably the piece I'd be likely to upgrade, but that upgrade would cost me 10 or more divine orbs, so I've held off on doing so and also see no need to. This set of boots cost me only one divine orb. For a budget set, you could go as low as 40 exalts by just simply looking for 30% movement speed instead of 35, 120 maximum life, and 2 resistant lines on any dexterity base, and just not worry about the evasion the boots have or haven't. Well, that's our entire inventory of gear, but we also, of course, need to cover the jewels socketed in our passive tree, which we have 7 of with this build. The best in slot jewels would be to utilize 5, 14 to 15% increased bonus from equipped quiver prefixes for 70% to 75% increased effectiveness of your equipped quiver. This, combined with our passive tree's master fletching notable, would grant us 150% more stats from our currently equipped quiver for 5 additional projectile levels, as well as a ton of extra great stats. And while there is an argument to be made utilizing the adorned unique diamond with corrupted magic quiver effect jewels, I am not going to recommend doing this. As I've said, you'll run into massive mana issues if you stack too many projectile levels, as it'll continue to scale your ball lightning ranks, costing you almost double the mana if you do this, potentially breaking the fragile equilibrium we've achieved through Thief's Torment. Not to mention, there is absolutely no reason to try to scale your damage this far, especially not if it's going to make the build unplayable due to mana deficiency. So instead, the best in slot jewels for this build would be 5 jewels with 14 to 15% increased bonus from quiver effect and 20% increased evasion for prefixes, with attack speed and attack speed with bows 4% in the suffixes for a total of 8% attack speed. With your last 2 remaining jewels being 16% increased damage with bows, 20% increased evasion, and the 2 attack speed suffixes. There is also an argument to be made for instead using movement speed suffixes for more movement speed over attack speed. Thing is, though, this best in slot quiver jewel basically doesn't even exist. So it'd be completely unrealistic to snag 5 of them. Not to mention, the other 2 jewels basically don't exist either. So if the best in slot option's basically unobtainable no matter how many hundreds of divine orbs someone had, what have I done instead? Instead, I've prioritized getting 2 quiver effect jewels with only around 10% or more, with any damage bonus, that being lightning damage, damage with bows, projectile damage, and so on, with either the attack speed or attack speed with bows suffix and a throwaway suffix. Even then, these 2 jewels in the current market have risen to 5 divs apiece, thanks to more people catching on how good quiver effect is. With 20% quiver effect total, though, we get to the 100% lower breakpoint with our passive tree, netting us 1 extra skill level, providing us with a pretty decent little damage spike. For the rest of my jewels, I attempted to get 15% or more increased evasion with any damage dealing prefix, like lightning damage, projectile damage, or damage with bows of 10% or higher. Then, instead of looking for both attack speed suffixes or movement speed, I substituted one of the suffixes with critical chance for attacks. Although critical hits aren't great for the build, extra damage, again, is extra damage, and this kept my jewels relatively affordable for a late game character. In the end, I didn't pay more than 1 to 2 divines per jewel, and sometimes even exalts. When it comes to budgeting a set of jewels for this build, though, prioritize damage dealing prefixes up to a sum of 15% or more, and one of the attack speed lines with whatever other suffix you can get on the cheap. This won't cost you more than 10 exalts apiece to snag a full set of decent jewels for yourself. So, what are our important takeaways from the gearing segment? The unicorn best in slot items are unobtainable amounts of currency, magnitudes more expensive than either my set or the budget set. But they aren't meant to be something you actually achieve, just a representation of what perfection could look like should you choose to chase after it or attempt to emulate it. More importantly, even mid tier items can perform and complete all content in the game utilizing this build, as demonstrated by my personal gear set. While some would say my current gear set is also expensive, I would argue this represents a character that I've put many hours into within the endgame already and was progression I made along the way towards conquering all the content in the game in a very natural way. And the budget set I've listed out is a much better representation of a set of gear that's capable of completing all content in the game, with likely only a few upgrades for tier 4 pinnacles. Originally, I was going to also leave a list of trade site links so you could easily shop for the budget gear. However, when videos like these release, it already promotes price fixing, and I'd like as many people as possible actually looking to play the build to be able to purchase these items, meaning it'd be a bad idea if I provided convenient links for price fixers to gouge the gear with. With the gear section concluded, I'm now going to be answering some of your frequently asked questions. When I released my previous build guide, I was getting a lot of the same comments over and over, and while I did try to answer them each time, this was happening often enough that I've just decided to also answer the most popular ones within the video itself here. One of the top questions I got was, why can't I equip supports to my cast on shock gem? The answer is it's a common bug with the console version of the game at the moment. I don't know the exact fix, but I've heard going to your game settings and disabling gem cutting restrictions can potentially help you get around this. Regardless, I promise you are in fact able to equip every support gem I've recommended in this build and should be able to find a workaround. If you know the exact workaround, I'd appreciate it if you could post it in the comments for everyone below. The next most popular question I got was, how do I get to the 95 intelligence required for this build? That seems pretty high. The answer is having some extra attributes from your gear. Common places you can look to pick these up are going to be on your bow, quiver, body armor, or amulet. Once you get a Howa glove, the stat requirement also becomes significantly easier. Beyond this, you'll also be allocating your passive tree attribute nodes primarily to fit whatever you still need requirements wise, with anything extra on top dumped into dexterity or intelligence up to 150 if upgrading your Orb of Storms. If you reach the minimum level to utilize Cast on Shock and can't get the intelligence requirements right away, don't worry about it too much, as Cast on Shock Ball Lightning really only starts to scale up in the end game anyway. The next most frequently asked question was, why do you fire so many more ball lightnings than me? Am I doing something wrong? Typically, the answer to this is going to be no, you're not. Ball lightning is primarily proccing off the shocks we inflict with our lightning rods. Now, we can have a lot of lightning rods deployed, and each one is potentially causing a shock, but the individual damage of these rods is comparatively low, meaning the shock chance is going to start out on a low end. But once we start hitting hard enough, these rods consistently will begin causing shocks all at once, and you'll start to see tons of ball lightning procs having finally started rolling over the enemy's ailment thresholds. So basically, just keep investing in your gear, keep leveling up, and eventually you're going to start seeing beams of ball lightning fire at rares and bosses all the time. And don't forget to utilize Voltaic Mark for the multiplicative shock chance and avoid ailment threshold suffixes on your waystones, as those will also be destroying your shock rate. The next most common question was, what do I think about Herald of Ice, or is it good to run this build incorporating Herald of Ice? Personally, I find the opportunity cost for the Herald interaction is a bit too high. The only real advantage of Herald of Ice compared to this build setup is shattering enemies to prevent on death effects, as we're already capable of proliferating screens with just the Herald of Thunder. This also costs a lot of top end damage, and without 150 spirit, requires you to drop cast on shock during mapping, something I feel is not at all worth it, especially if farming breach, where the ball lightning still contributes greatly to both general clear speed and instant rare elimination with less gear requirements to perform than the Herald of Ice variant. You'll be able to freeze bosses, but this build already can crowd control a boss with Electrocuting Arrow, so there isn't much of a benefit there. So you can incorporate Herald of Ice and cold damage if you really want to, but I feel as though the barrier to entry on the gearing of the build is going to be overall much higher, and your top end DPS will be lower for the average player. Next question I saw popping up a lot was, how do you not get one shot? Well, the answer is I do sometimes. When you're running a build with mediocre chaos resistance or relying on evasion for survivability, you are going to just drop dead every once in a while. The trick is keeping the frequency of this event low. With over 2,000 life, 75% evasion with acrobatics, and good game sense avoiding charging through on death effects, I managed to avoid the vast majority of possible deaths and am continuing to make good progress on experience gains going towards level 97. At the end of the day, this build is not abusing meta definers like Grim Feast and Energy Shield, which are actually likely going to be nerfed soon anyway, so you are going to die every once in a while. But scale your max life, cap your elemental resistances, stack your evasion with acrobatics, grit your teeth, and you'll perform just fine. Just don't play this build in hardcore. Lastly, I was asked often, should I use what's in this video or what you've posted to the text guide on Mobalytics? After this video goes live, I will continually update the text-based guides should anything ever change. So if you want to keep up to date with anything I alter beyond this point, you'll just need to follow either the Maxroll or Mobalytics page and utilize anything that changes there, as those pages are always going to be as up to date as possible beyond the video. Should you have any questions for me regarding the build, feel free to hit me up in my community Discord linked below. We're gathering all the Deadeye enjoyers there, following along and discussing the build there daily. I'm also happy to take a look at your gear, character, or anything you like and offer my advice on how to improve your character in our build theory craft section. If you otherwise have any further questions not covered in the FAQ section, comment them below and I'll try my best to answer them. For those of you that want a text-based guide, there will be a detailed upload to Mobalytics and later Maxroll, including all of the information contained within this video for you to reference at your convenience moving forward. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you left it a like and shared it around, as it'll help me continue being able to make content for Path of Exile 2 full-time on my channel. And feel free to comment below any ideas or content you'd like to see covered in the future. Thank you to my coffee supporters who help keep the channel going, and thank you very much for watching till the end. I will see you next time.